I've been thinking about tonight's episode for several days now, carrying it around with me in the way that you carry something you intend to give to someone, carefully, waiting for the right moment. And I've decided that this is the right moment, that this, whatever evening this is for you, wherever you are, however the day treated you, this is the moment for this particular story. Tonight, I'm bringing you something that lives in a tradition I find endlessly compelling, the long fable. Not the quick moral at the end variety, not the children's picture book fable, but the ancient kind, the kind that the first storytellers understood as essential work, the kind spoken over fire for the duration of a winter night, the kind that doesn't rush toward its meaning, but takes you on a genuine journey through dark and cold and uncertainty before it brings you anywhere near the warmth. This is a story about guardianship, about what it costs to be the one who stays when everyone else has gone, about loneliness and solitude and the thin but critical difference between them, about what we owe to the things we love and what we owe to ourselves, and the long, difficult process of figuring out that these two deaths are not as opposed as they first appear. This is a story about fire, but really it is a story about anything worth tending, anything you have chosen to protect, to preserve, to remain present for, even when the remaining is hard. I find myself returning to this story at particular moments in my own life, the moments when the thing I care about seems small and the world seems indifferent, and the question of whether the care is worth the cost becomes suddenly, urgently alive. This story doesn't answer that question, but it does something more useful. It keeps you company while you live inside it. If you're new here, welcome. You've chosen a good evening to arrive. If you'd like more, extended discussions, reading lists, the community that's grown around these kinds of stories, our Patreon is in the description below. No pressure. The stories are always free, but the conversation is worth finding if you're looking for it. Now, I want you to let the day go. Whatever it was, set it down. Picture a landscape stripped to its essentials. No trees, no softness, gray stone and old ash, and a sky the color of pewter. That particular gray that isn't threatening and isn't forgiving, just present, just watching. The light is failing. In the middle of this emptiness, there is one point of warmth, one small, barely breathing ember, orange at its center, ash gray at its edges, casting just enough light to make the darkness around it deliberate rather than absolute. And beside it, perfectly still, copper-furred, ancient in a way that had nothing to do with years, a fox. She has been there a very long time. The fox who guarded the last ember. Prologue: the fire in its greatness. You should know first what it was before it became what it is, before the diminishment and the forgetting and the long gray years of the vigil. You should know what it was at its fullest, because the story does not make its proper weight felt unless you understand what was at stake, unless you understand what last means. The fire at the center of the world had been burning since before the world understood itself in years. It predated calendars and the counting of seasons, predated in some deep and inarguable way the human habit of marking time at all. There had been warmth before there were words for warmth, and the warmth had come from here, from this place, from this fire that did not owe its existence to any fuel or any hand, but arrived simply from wherever fire arrives when it arrives of its own accord. In those earliest centuries, the fire was enormous. Not enormous in the way of a bonfire or a burning building, not spectacular, not theatrical, not the kind of enormous that announces itself as spectacle. Enormous in the way that a mountain is enormous, by the simple fact of its presence reshaping everything in relation to it. If you stood at its edge, and in the beginning you could not stand at its edge, you had to stand at a significant distance even from its outermost warmth. If you stood at its edge, the heat was not merely felt in the skin or the hands or the face. It was felt in the bones, in the breath, in something underneath the breath, in whatever it is in a living thing that understands warmth before the thinking mind has processed it, before the conscious self has registered it. You felt it first in that place, and the feeling was not comfort precisely. It was something older and more fundamental than comfort. It was recognition. The first people who came to it were not because they had been told to. They came because something in them, that deep pre-linguistic register, had felt the warmth from impossible distances and had not been able to explain the feeling and had followed it anyway, because some poles are too fundamental to argue with. They walked across landscapes no human had named yet, through darkness that had not yet been described in any story, because there was no one yet to tell stories about it, following a warmth that kept insisting on itself against every reasonable analysis of how far they had already come. When they arrived, they didn't have words for what they found. They stood at the distance that the heat required of them, and they looked, and the looking itself did something to them, something that was not possible to undo, and that none of them afterward wished to undo. The fire gave them language, not immediately, not in the way of a direct gift neatly wrapped and handed over. It gave them language the way that intense experiences always give us language, by providing something so enormous and so specific that the inadequacy of existing vocabulary becomes intolerable, and the inadequacy generates the new words needed to describe it. They built their first words at the fire's edge: warm, light, here, together. These are the oldest words in any language, and they all point back to the same origin, to a group of people standing at the edge of something that was larger than they were, trying to tell each other about it. Over the generations, hundreds of them, then thousands, the fire became the organizing principle of the world. Not in any enforced or hierarchical way. There was no doctrine of the fire, no priesthood, no official theology. It was simply the place that everything oriented towards, the way plants orient towards light, not because they have been told to, but because their nature points that way, and the light is real. People traveled from the furthest edges of the known world to sit beside it, to think beside it, to grieve beside it, to celebrate beside it. They brought their most difficult questions and their most important news.
They brought their children to see it, and their elders to die beside it. They brought the things they had made, and the stories they had told, and the problems they had not yet solved. The fire did not solve problems. It did not answer questions. It was not an oracle, and it was not a god, in at least any sense that required worship or propitiation. It was simply the place where thinking happened best, where the most honest conversations occurred, where the things that were difficult to say in ordinary life, in the busy, distracted, socially complicated context of the day-to-day, became somehow permissible, because the fire held a kind of permission in it that ordinary life did not provide. In its light, people told each other the truth, not always, not perfectly, but more than elsewhere, more than anywhere else. And so the fire was also, over thousands of years, the repository of everything true that the people had ever said to each other. The accumulated weight of all those honest conversations sat in it, the way a piece of music carries within it all the practice that went into learning it. You could not separate the fire from what had been spoken at its edge. They had become the same thing. They sent keepers to tend it. In the early generations, the keepership was the most honored position in the world, not because it came with power or wealth or any of the ordinary currencies of honor, but because everyone understood, without being told, that the keeper was the most important person alive at any given moment. Not the cleverest, not the strongest, not the most influential, the most important, because importance, properly understood, has nothing to do with what you can accumulate and everything to do with what you prevent from being lost. The keepers gave their lives to it. This was not considered a sacrifice. It was considered a calling, the particular kind of calling that chooses you rather than the other way around. You knew if you were a keeper the way you knew if you were left-handed, by the evidence of how the world felt when you acted in accordance with it, and how it felt when you didn't. The keepers who tried to leave came back. Not all of them, but the ones the fire chose always came back, and they always came back knowing something they hadn't known before they left. Knowing, with the clarity that the leaving had paradoxically provided, what the fire actually meant to them and why. Chapter 1: The Age of Forgetting. The forgetting came the way most catastrophes come, in the ordinary clothes of a reasonable Tuesday, looking entirely unlike a catastrophe until it was too late to mistake it for anything else.
It did not begin with a single act of negligence. If it had been a single act, one moment of carelessness, one keeper who failed in their duty through laziness or indifference, it would have been a tragedy, but it would have been a legible tragedy, the kind with a clear cause and a clear lesson. This was not that kind of story. The forgetting was not caused by anyone in particular, which made it far more difficult to understand and far more impossible to assign blame for. It emerged instead from an accumulation of small and individually defensible decisions, each of which was reasonable in isolation and catastrophic in aggregate. This is the most common mechanism of real catastrophe, and the least satisfying one, because it offers no villain, no moment of decision that could have been made differently, no single point at which a single person with better judgment could have intervened. There is only the weight of all the small decisions pressing down, and the way their individual reasonableness does nothing to mitigate their collective consequence. The first generation to begin the forgetting did not think of themselves as forgetting anything. They were busy, genuinely busy, in the way of people who have taken a great inheritance and are doing their capable best to expand it. They were building,
roads and trading routes and new settlements at the furthest edges of the known world. They were discovering new languages, new foods, new people, new forms of knowledge that had developed in isolation from the fire and that offered perspectives the fire's centrality had not generated. They were growing in ways that were genuinely impressive and genuinely good, and the growth required their attention, and their attention was finite, and the fire, which had always been the center, began in the accounting of their daily lives to become one item in a longer list. They still sent keepers. This is important. They did not stop sending keepers. They did not formally decide to reduce the keepership's significance. They simply, and this is the precise word, simply, the word that carries everything in its plainness, they simply lived as though the fire were slightly less central than it had been, as though their relationship to it was one of respect and maintenance rather than of fundamental dependence. They were wrong, but they were wrong in no way that was immediately visible, and this is the particular cruelty of this kind of wrongness. The consequences do not arrive until well after the habit has calcified. The second generation inherited the busyness and the slightly attenuated relationship simultaneously. They kept the keepership going. They told the stories of the fire at festivals and holidays, the great origin stories, the stories of the first people following the warmth across the dark, the stories of what it meant and what was said at its edge. They told these stories with genuine feeling. They were not cynics. They were not performatively reverent in the way that conceals indifference. They genuinely believed in the fire's importance. But there is a difference, a small difference, barely legible in any individual instance, but immense in its accumulated effect. There is a difference between believing in something's importance and organizing your daily life around it. The second generation believed, but they did not organize. The fire was important the way certain historical buildings are important, worth preserving, worth marking, worth visiting on occasions of particular significance. Not worth, and this is where the difference lives, in the territory of not worth the daily, unglamorous, completely ordinary attention of a person whose life is organized around its continuation. The third generation completed the transition without knowing they were completing anything. By their time, the keepership had become ceremonial. The keepers went, dressed in the old traditional garments, and performed the old traditional practices, and returned with a feeling of honoring something ancient and valuable. They were not wrong to feel this. The honoring was real, but honoring is not the same as tending, and they had begun to confuse the two, had begun to believe because the fire had survived all this time under all this reduced attendance, that the fire was essentially self-sufficient, essentially permanent, essentially independent of the daily attention that generations before them had understood in their bones that it required. The warmth still radiated from the stones surrounding it. The people pointed to this as evidence of the fire's vitality. They did not understand that they were pointing to residual heat, the stored warmth of 1,000 years of burning, slowly releasing itself into the stone, independent whether the fire was still burning at its former strength. By the time you can feel the cold at the center of a great stone, the fire that warmed it has been diminished for a long time. But stones are patient things, and they release their warmth slowly, and the patience of the stone reads to the careless observer as the vigor of the fire. The fourth generation did not send keepers at all for a period of 7 years, because there were other things that demanded urgency, and the fire which had survived so long and seemed so permanent, would surely be all right. It had survived for thousands of years. It would be all right for 7.
It was not all right for 7. By the time the keepers returned, the great fire was no longer great. What they found was a fire, still, technically, inarguably a fire, with genuine flame and genuine warmth, but a fire so reduced in scale and intensity that the keepers stood at its edge, and some of them wept, and some of them did not weep because weeping felt inadequate to the scale of what had happened. And all of them understood, with the horrible clarity of consequences arriving too late to prevent, that what they were looking at was not what had been left to them. What they were looking at was what neglect looked like when applied over time to something irreplaceable. They tried to restore it. Of course they tried. They were not cruel people, not indifferent people, only people who had made the oldest mistake in the world, which is the mistake of believing that important things will wait for you to become ready to attend to them. They tried. They brought fuel, and they brought attention, and they brought, belatedly and painfully, the full weight of their urgency. But fire, real fire, the deep kind, the kind that connects to whatever source fires of this nature connect to, fire cannot be restored the way a building can be restored, or a language can be revived. It cannot be inflated back to its former dimensions by the application of sufficient effort. It diminishes by its own logic, and it grows, if it grows, by its own logic, and the most that human attention can do is provide the conditions that make growth possible, and wait, and hope. They provided the conditions. They waited. The fire did not grow. It continued to diminish, slowly, steadily, by the arithmetic of irreversible processes, the way a tide going out can be observed but not stopped. Generation by generation, tending by tending, the fire reduced itself towards the thing it would eventually become. An ember, one ember, the last one. Chapter 2. The Last Keeper. Her name, as has been said, was Seren, which meant bright star in the old language, a language she knew only as sound rather than meaning, so she carried her name without knowing what it contained, the way we often carry the most important things about ourselves. She was a good keeper. This is worth saying clearly, because the story of the last keeper is easily distorted into a story of failure, and failure was not what happened. She had been attentive and skilled and genuinely devoted, more devoted arguably than the several generations before her, who had kept the keepership going on the strength of tradition rather than understanding. She had understood. She had felt the fire's nature in the way the original keepers had felt it, in the pre-linguistic register, in the bones and the breath, in whatever part of a person knows warmth before the mind does. She was the real thing. What happened to her was grief. Grief arrived in the particular way that sometimes it does, not as a single blow, which would have been grievous but survivable, but as a series of losses arriving in such rapid succession that there was no time to absorb one before the next had landed. In the space of a single year, she lost her mother, then her closest companion of 30 years, then her only student, the young woman she had been preparing to take her place, who died in an accident so arbitrary and so stupid that the arbitrariness of it itself was a kind of violence. One loss could be held, 2 losses in proximity could be held with effort, 3 losses coming like blows in a fight that doesn't let you get up between them made her incapable of standing upright anywhere.
She left the fire's side on a morning in late autumn, a gray morning, unremarkable, except that she did not come back from it. She walked into the landscape, and she kept walking, not towards anything, but simply away, in the direction that grief pointed, which is rarely the direction of the things that matter most to us. She had every intention of returning. She told herself as she walked, "I will return. I will return when I can breathe properly again. I will return when the weight of this is more manageable." This was not a lie. She genuinely believed it. But the grief had its own geography, and the path back turned out to be a path she could not, in the end, find. Not because it was hidden, because some roads back require a version of yourself that the road away has consumed.
She survived. She lived a long life in a distant place, and she thought about the fire every day of that life, and she was not indifferent to it. The loss of it, the abandonment of it, the knowledge of what she had left undone was a sorrow she carried until the end. But thinking about something and tending it are not the same thing. Sorrow is not the same as presence. She knew this. The knowing was its own particular grief, layered underneath the grief that had driven her away, like a stone beneath a stone. She was gone. The fire had one keeper, a fox. Or more precisely, the fox became the keeper in the way that someone becomes the person responsible in a room when everyone else has left, not by choice, not by appointment, but by simple presence and by the inability to leave. Chapter 3. The Guardian's First Years. She had been watching the fire for a long time before she became its guardian. For several generations of human lifetimes, in fact. She had watched from the edges, had observed the keepership from a distance with the particular perspective of a creature who lives outside the human tendency to take important things for granted. She had watched the fire diminish, and she had watched the human relationship to it shift from centrality to maintenance, to ceremony to intermittent acknowledgement. And she had experienced throughout this watching a rising discomfort that she did not at first recognize as what it was. It was responsibility. The feeling of responsibility arriving before the decision to accept it, which is how genuine responsibility always arrives, not as a choice made from strength, but as an inevitability felt before it is named. When Saren walked away, the fox waited a full year. She told herself she was waiting for the keeper to return. She told herself that it was not her place, that the fire was not hers, that the keepership was a human tradition, that there was surely someone who would come, who would understand what had happened and would come. She waited through the autumn and through the winter, and through a spring so tentative it was barely distinguishable from winter, and through a summer that felt apologetic. Nobody came. The fire continued to diminish. By the end of the year, the ember was barely the size of a clenched fist, and its breathing was more shallow than the fox could watch without feeling something close to panic, which was an emotion she had not previously believed herself capable of. She moved to its side on a morning in the second autumn with a decisiveness that surprised her, not gradual, not tentative, but sudden and complete, the way a decision is made when it has been forming for a long time and finally arrives with the force of everything that was gathered into it. She simply walked to the ember's side and sat down,
and looked at it and said, very quietly and to no one in particular, "All right then." These were the first words she had spoken aloud in several years. They were not inspiring. They were not the beginning of anything that felt heroic or meaningful from the inside. They were the words of someone who has stopped arguing with the situation and begun dealing with it, which is the only way anything is actually dealt with. The first years were difficult in ways she had not anticipated. She had imagined, in the abstract, what the vigil would ask of her, had tried to prepare herself in the year of waiting for the specific demands of remaining in one place beside one small object for an indefinite period. She had not adequately prepared. The abstract is always more manageable than the specific, and the specific demands of this particular vigil turned out to be considerably more interior than she had expected. The physical requirements were straightforward enough. She learned the Ember's rhythms, the shallow morning breathing and the deeper settling of the night hours, the way cold weather required careful monitoring, while warm weather allowed a certain relaxed confidence, the difference between a dimming that was ordinary fluctuation and a dimming that required intervention. She learned what intervention meant in practice, not the dramatic intervention of a person in crisis, but the small, precise, attentive adjustments of someone keeping a very delicate thing alive. A slight shift of her body to block an unexpected wind, a careful examination when the color changed, a sustained presence during the hours when the Ember seemed most inclined towards giving up. There were such hours, usually in the depths of the night, between the second and third hours before dawn, when the Ember's pulse became very slow and very shallow, and the fox sat very still and very close, and did the thing she had identified, eventually, as the most essential act of the vigil. It knew it. Not watched, not guarded in the defensive sense, knew, the way you know someone, the way your knowing of someone is itself a kind of presence that they feel, a kind of attestation that they exist and matter and are not alone. The interior difficulties were more complex and arrived more slowly, the way interior things do. The loneliness was the largest of them and the most various. It was not one experience, but many, cycling through the seasons and the hours with their own logic. There was the loneliness of sameness, the particular quality of loss that arrives when days become indistinguishable, when the texture of time flattens, and the difference between this morning and the last 100 mornings cannot be identified. There was the loneliness of watching the world move from a fixed point, the birds that arrived in spring and departed in autumn, the occasional distant sound of human activity carried on the wind from somewhere she could not see, the suggestion of lives being lived in full while she remained where she was, tending the same small thing. The loneliness of doubt was the one she never entirely resolved. She found peace with it eventually, found a way to carry it without being weighed down by it, the way you carry an old injury that no longer limits you but is still part of your body. But it never went away. She decided after many years that this was correct, that a doubt-free vigil would be a complacent one, and that the doubt was doing something useful, was keeping her honest, keeping her present, preventing her from settling into a guardianship of habit rather than of genuine, living attention.
Chapter 4. The Nature of the Vigil.
What most people do not understand about a vigil, the real kind, the sustained kind, not the single night of watching, but the years of it, is that it is not primarily a physical act. The physical requirements are real and they matter, and anyone who dismisses them has not kept a real vigil. But the physical requirements are the smaller part of it. The larger part is entirely interior. It is the practice of continued choosing. Every day that the fox stayed was a day on which she chose to stay. Not once in the beginning, in some grand founding moment of commitment, but freshly, each day, in the ordinary ongoing way of things that require continuous maintenance. This is the thing about genuine commitment that romantic narratives almost universally get wrong. Commitment is not a single act of will performed with full knowledge and total certainty at some founding moment. That is not what commitment is, and anything you maintain on the strength of a single founding decision is not a contract, and contracts are brittle things. Commitment is the daily choosing, the unremarkable, unglamorous, often uninspiring practice of deciding again, this morning, in these specific and perhaps difficult circumstances, that yes, this, still. The fox had made this choice every morning for a very long time. Most mornings it was not a dramatic choice. Most mornings it was merely the choice to arise from sleep and attend to the ember and eat what could be found nearby and do the work of the day, which was simple and necessary and did not require elaboration. But on the hard mornings, and there were hard mornings reliably in every season, often without warning or apparent cause, arriving with the arbitrary authority of weather. On those mornings, the choice required something real, required her to find something in herself that was more than habit, more than inertia, more than the resistance to disruption that keeps most of us doing most of the things we do. Required, in the plainest sense, a reason. She had collected reasons, not consciously, not as a project, not as an inventory of motivation to be consulted in moments of doubt. They had simply accumulated, the way understanding accumulates in anyone who is paying honest attention, gradually, unevenly, with many revisions and some wrong turns, and occasional unannounced moments of startling clarity. The first reason, the founding reason, the one that had walked her to the ember's side that autumn morning and made her say, "All right then," was the simplest one. She could not bear to let it go out. This was not a sophisticated reason. It was not a philosophical reason or a moral one. It was visceral, pre-rational, the same pull that had brought the first humans across the dark toward a warmth they couldn't explain. She felt the ember's meaning before she could articulate the meaning, and the felt meaning was enough. The later reasons were more complex. They arrived through the visits mostly, the accumulated evidence of what the ember still meant to the people who found their way to it. Through the young man's ruined boots and his careful eyes, and the story of the old woman facing west. Through the old woman with her practical tea and her economal voice, and the particular nod of someone who's been given a piece they didn't know they needed. Through the child who said, "I'd rather give everything to something true," and meant it with a plainness that made the complexity of reasoning that usually surrounded such sentiments seem suddenly unnecessary. And underneath it all, deepest and most durable, was this: the ember was a possible thing. It was simultaneously the last of what had been and the first of what could be. And this dual nature, this completeness of contradiction held without resolution, was the most honest description of anything truly alive that the fox had ever encountered. To guard the ember was to guard the space of possibility itself, to insist, against the weight of everything that argued otherwise, that maybe was still a legitimate position, that the question was not closed, that the story was not yet over. She had lived long enough to understand that this was no small thing to insist on. Chapter 5. The First Visitor, the Young Man. He arrived in winter, not the winter of storms, the aftermath winter, the winter that comes when the storms have exhausted themselves and left behind only silence and a cold so total that it has the quality of a statement. The kind of winter that presses down without drama or spectacle, simply continuing, steadily and without relief, past the point at which continuing seems warranted.
He had been walking for 3 weeks. This was evident in the specific geography of his exhaustion, not the fresh exhaustion of a single hard day, which sits on the surface of a person and can be read in the tension around their eyes, but the older exhaustion that has worked its way through to the structural level, to the posture and the gait, and the particular blankness of expression that is not indifference, but the conservation of what little energy remains for the things that absolutely require it. His boots had failed at some point around the 2nd week, and he had replaced them with strips of heavy coat tied with a cord, which spoke to both the length of the journey and to a particular kind of practical intelligence, not the intelligence that prevents the boots from failing, but the intelligence that works with what is available after they have. He was, the fox estimated, in his mid-20s. He had good hands, the hands of someone accustomed to work with the useful calluses in the right places, and good eyes, the kind of eyes that look at things carefully rather than quickly, and that have developed a slight permanent squint from the sustained practice of careful looking. He stopped at a distance of 6 feet, which she recognized as the distance at which people stop when they have prepared a speech and have suddenly lost confidence in it. Not in its content, which they still believe in, but in its form, which seems suddenly inadequate for what they actually need to say. She waited. She had learned to wait. Waiting was perhaps the most important practical skill the vigil had developed in her, and the most transferable. "I've come for the fire," he said. He said it with the simplicity of someone who has rehearsed a thing enough times that the rehearsal has worn away the ceremony and left only the essential statement. "I can see that," she said. He looked at the ember. His face moved through several expressions in rapid succession, the expressions of someone processing a significant gap between expectation and reality. He had been told of the fire. He had built an image of it from the stories. The image and the ember were dimensionally extremely far apart.
"That's all there is?" he asked. "That's all there is." "I thought—" He stopped, started again. "The stories described something—" "The stories were accurate," she said, "when they were told. What they described existed in the form they described. Then time passed, as time does when it is not sufficiently attended to, and things became as they are now. Both of these facts are equally true. Holding both simultaneously is more useful than insisting on only one." He sat in the ash, not with ceremony. He sat the way a person sits when the legs have decided before the mind has caught up. He was quiet for a while, and she allowed the quiet its necessary space. "Can I take some?" he asked at last. "A piece of it, to bring back?" "Tell me why," she said, not as a challenge, as a genuine inquiry. She had learned that the reasons people gave for wanting the fire were the most important part of any conversation she would have with them, because the reasons told you not just what they wanted, but who they were and what they understood. He told her about the village. He told it carefully and in full, the way someone tells a story they have been composing for weeks, because he had been composing this, on the long walk, rehearsing it against the cold. There were several hundred people in a valley 2 weeks' walk east. They had been prosperous by the ordinary measures of prosperity. They had food and shelter and a functioning economy of goods and labor. But there was something missing. He had been trying to name it for years before he found in the oldest stories a word for it, and the word was permission, which was not what he had expected to find. They had everything material that people need, and they lacked the feeling that the having of it was enough, the feeling that they were allowed to rest in what they had, to know it, to be grateful for it without the constant anxious sense that something more was required, that the meaning of their lives was located somewhere they hadn't yet found. He had heard from an old man dying in a winter 3 years ago about the fire, about what the fire had given, about the quality of knowing that sitting at its edge had produced, and he had thought, he had spent 3 years thinking before he walked, that if he could bring back even a fragment, he could give his people the thing they were missing, the permission, the okayness of being where you are and knowing what you know and letting that be enough. The fox listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She had the patience now for the full length of a person's need, and she knew that interrupting it in the name of efficiency or time or the desire to get to the point was a way of telling someone that their need was less important than your response to it, which is one of the most corrosive things you can communicate to a person who has walked 3 weeks to be heard. When she was finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're not wrong in anything you've said," she told him. "Not in the need, not in the logic, not in the love that drove you here on those feet. All of it is real, and all of it matters." She looked at the ember. "But I can't give you a piece of it, not because I won't, because I can't." The word last is not a description of rarity, it is arithmetic. If I give pieces of the last to everyone who comes with a real need, and the needs are always real, the people who find their way here are not frivolous people. They are people who have walked through cold for weeks in wrapped feet, people who are trying to bring something necessary to people they love. If I give pieces of the last to each of them, there is no last remaining, and what I am keeping here is not the warmth alone. I am keeping the possibility, the chance that what was lost can be found whole. A piece of the ember in your valley would give your people something. I won't diminish that, but it would not give them the thing they're actually missing, which is not a fragment of warmth, but a full restoration of knowing. The permission you described, that does not live in a fragment, it lives in the whole. And the whole requires the last ember to remain intact until the conditions for its renewal arrives. He was quiet. working something through. She could see it in his face, the face of someone taking in information that conflicts with their plan and not trying to argue it away, but genuinely integrating it, which is a different and much rarer response. "What are the conditions," he asked, "for the renewal? What would have to happen?" She considered. "I don't know exactly," she said. "I have been asking that question for a long time, and I have partial answers. What I know is this: the fire did not diminish because of a single failure. It diminished through accumulated forgetting over generations. The restoration, if it comes, will come in kind, not through a single dramatic act, but through the accumulation of many ordinary acts of remembering. People like you walking long distances in bad weather to ask serious questions. People like the old village elder who told the dying man the story, and the dying man who told it to you. Every time the knowledge passes, every time a person receives the true understanding of what was lost and why it matters, and carries that understanding back into their ordinary life, the conditions for the fire's renewal are slightly and genuinely improved." She looked at him steadily. "You did not come here for nothing," she said. "You came here for this, for the knowledge of what happened and why, for the understanding that will let you tell your people the true story rather than a comforting approximation of it. That is not nothing. That is in fact the most useful thing I can give you, and it will do more for your valley than a fragment of Ember ever could." He sat with this for a long time. The afternoon light fell across the stones, that particular thin, honest winter light that illuminates without warmth. The Ember breathed. The cold continued. "The old woman facing west," he said eventually. "When I go back, I'm going to ask her why." "Yes," the fox said. "That's exactly right."
He stayed the night. He slept beside the ember's thin warmth and did not speak again until morning. And in the morning he rose and wrapped his feet in the coat strips with a careful efficiency that the fox found quietly moving, the efficiency of someone who has accepted the condition of their feet and is working with what is available, without drama or self-pity. He stood for a moment, looking at the ember. He said, "Will you tell me its name, in the old language, what the fire was called?" She said, "I can tell you the shape of the word, but not its meaning, because the meaning is not for telling. The meaning is for knowing, and knowing requires sitting where you are sitting now, for long enough that the knowing arrives on its own terms." She made a sound, brief, low, entirely unlike any human phoneme that was the approximate shape of the fire's old name in the old language. He listened to it with the careful attention of his careful eyes, and she saw him hold it, and knew he would carry it back, and knew he would not be able to say it exactly, but would say it close enough that someone in the valley who had heard it in a dream might recognize it. He left without looking back. She found this respectable. Looking back was for people who were not yet certain of their leaving. He was certain. She turned back to the ember. It was still breathing. Chapter 6. The Season Between. Winter dissolved into spring with the reluctance of a season that has been long and does not know how to let go gracefully. It went in fits, cold mornings interrupting warm afternoons, frost arriving where flowers had already decided to risk opening, the light improving and then retreating, and then improving again, as though practicing. The fox spent this season in a state of heightened attention that had nothing to do with the ember and everything to do with the young man's questions, which had lodged in her the way useful questions do, not as problems requiring solutions, but as orientations, as slight adjustments to the angle from which she looked at things, which changed what was visible. He had asked about the conditions for renewal.
She had given him the truest answer she had, which was partial and incomplete, as the truest answers to the largest questions almost always are. But the asking had turned the question back to her, and she found herself attending to it with a freshness she hadn't brought it to in years. Not urgently. Urgency was not the right register for this kind of question, but with a renewed quality of aliveness, a sense that the question had more in it than she had previously excavated, and that the excavation was worth the continuing. She thought about the accumulated forgetting and its reverse, the accumulated remembering that the renewal would require. She thought about all the small acts of truth-telling and story-carrying and honest questioning that were happening right now at distances she could not see in the ordinary lives of people who were working towards something they did not have a name for. The young man carrying the shape of the fire's old name back to a valley where an old woman sat facing west. All the people who had come before him, who had walked to this place and walked away again, carrying the knowledge in some form that would diffuse into the world and become part of the slow collective work of remembering. She had always thought of herself as the only one doing the work of preservation. The vigil had always felt, from the inside, entirely solitary, her attention against the dark, her staying against the forgetting. But perhaps this was not accurate. Perhaps the work was distributed in ways she could not see from her fixed position. Perhaps the vigil was not a solitary act, but the visible center of a much larger invisible pattern, the way a teacher is the visible center of a learning that happens in the minds of students across a lifetime, long after the teacher has spoken. She found this thought genuinely comforting, in the way that true things are genuinely comforting. Not reassuring, not the false comfort of telling yourself things are better than they are. The true comfort of a thought that correctly describes the situation, and in correctly describing it, reveals that the situation contains more than you had previously been able to see. The birds arrived in late spring. Not many. This was not a landscape that attracted abundance, but enough. Their voices in the evenings were the most ordinary thing in her world, and were for that reason the most restorative. She sat on the warm rock and listened to them, and tended the ember, and waited, with the particular quality of waiting that had nothing urgent in it, for what came next.
She arrived in the tentative warmth of early summer, moving at the unhurried pace of someone who has made peace with her own slowness, not resigned to it, not apologetic about it, but genuinely at peace, in the way that peace is only ever genuine when it has been arrived at through the full, honest experience of its alternatives. She was old in the way that a few people get old when they have been paying honest attention their entire lives. Not diminished, but deepened. The lines in her face were the lines of accumulated specific expression, of frowning at something that deserved the full respect of a frown, of laughing at things that were actually funny, of concentrating with genuine concentration on things that required it, a face that has spent its years in honest relationship with the things that happened to it. This is different from a merely old face, and the fox could read the difference immediately. She had brought, in what seemed like an absurdly domesticated gesture for someone who had evidently traveled a considerable distance through difficult terrain, a clay pot and 2 cups. The pot had something inside it that steamed, which meant she had made a fire somewhere within the last hour, which meant she had passed through terrain where fuel was available. Information the fox filed away with the quiet completeness
of someone who has been cataloging their world for a long time. She poured without asking permission. She handed a cup to the fox with the matter-of-factness of someone who has decided, at some point in their life, that the business of making things comfortable for other people is not a performance, but simply a practice, unremarkable and ongoing. She sat on the ground with a controlled descent that spoke to long experience of getting to and from the ground under conditions of reduced flexibility. She said, "I'm not here for the fire." She replied, "I know." The woman looked at the fox with an expression of mild interest. "How?" she asked. The fox replied, "The way you approached. The people who come for the fire lean forward. The want is in their posture before they've said anything. You were straight." The woman considered this and nodded once, briefly, with the efficiency of someone filing away information. She said, "I heard about the young man, the one from the Eastern Valley." The fox replied, "News travels." The woman corrected, "Grief travels," with a precision that corrected the fox's choice without dismissing it. He came back carrying something that grieved him, even though he understood it, even though he believed in the answer you gave him. Grief and understanding are not mutually exclusive. Most adults know this, but it still surprises people when they encounter it in themselves. The fox drank the tea. It was pine resin and something bitter, and something she couldn't identify. The unidentified ingredient provided a pleasant, sustained attention, the way a question you can't quite answer does. She asked, "Why did you come?" "I told you, I'm not here for the fire." "That is what you are not here for," I asked. "What you are here for." The woman was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm here because I'm old enough to recognize what a very specific kind of loneliness looks like, and I've been in places where that loneliness lived without company for long enough to know what company can do. I didn't bring anything to offer you except time and tea, which seemed potentially more useful than more significant things." The fox was quiet. She had not expected this, had not expected honesty this clean, this direct, this entirely free of the performance that usually surrounded acts of kindness. Most people who came with kindness brought it wrapped in the additional gift of their own virtue, which meant accepting it required accepting a certain amount of obligatory gratitude that really was just reflected self-admiration. This woman brought tea and time and an accurate diagnosis with no extra packaging. "That is genuinely generous," the fox said, "and it is something I did not know I needed until this moment." They sat together as the early summer heat built and released, and the ember maintained its steady, shallow breathing, and the distant birds conducted their varied business. The silence between them was the comfortable kind, the silence of two people who are each accustomed to silence and have discovered in each other's company that silence is even better when it is shared. "Does it get lonely?" the woman asked eventually. The question was clinical in its delivery, not softened, not cushioned, asked the way a doctor asks about pain, because the accurate answer is more useful than the comfortable one. "Let me answer that honestly," the fox said, which means answering it slowly. She thought for a moment. "There is a loneliness here that I would not give up. It has made me something that I would not have become otherwise. It has developed in me a quality of attention and a capacity for stillness and a relationship to time that I think are genuinely valuable and that would not have grown in a life with more company. Solitude has been, on balance, one of the most productive conditions of my existence." She paused. "And there is a loneliness here that costs me things I cannot entirely account for. A loneliness that is not chosen, that is the leftover loneliness, the loneliness that arrives after all the useful solitude is accounted for, and there is still a remainder. The loneliness that is simply the absence of people who know you over time, the absence of being known." Another pause. "The young man's visit lasted less than 2 days. He knew me, by the end of it, more than most people know a stranger. But he didn't know me over time. He didn't know me who I had been last year and the year before, and how I had changed, and what had changed me. There is a specific quality of being known that requires duration, and duration is the one thing a vigil made of stays and departures cannot provide." The woman listened to all of this without interrupting, which the fox recognized as its own intelligence. "And yet you stay?" the woman asked. "And yet I stay, yes. Because of the ember? Because of the ember, and because of what the staying has made me, and because, this is perhaps the most honest reason, and the one that surprises me still every time I find myself arriving at it, because I genuinely do not know how not to, not in the sense of being trapped, in the sense of having become the kind of thing that does this, the way water is the kind of thing that runs downhill. Not compulsion, identity." The woman nodded. She had the look of someone who's been given a piece that fits something they didn't know had a gap in it. The particular satisfaction of completion that has nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with accuracy. She said, "You could leave." Not as encouragement, as a fact, offered to test the theory. "The ember could not," the fox said simply. They drank the rest of the tea. The afternoon passed around them with its particular summer slowness, all long shadows and dry grass sounds, and the ember's patient breathing. At some point, the woman fell asleep, briefly, in the way of old people in warm afternoons, and the fox sat beside her and did not move, maintaining the same quality of available stillness she maintained beside the ember, and found that the maintenance was not in different kind, that the quality of attention a person requires when they are sleeping trustingly near you is not entirely unlike the quality of attention an ember requires: a presence, a knowing, a readiness. The woman woke and said, without preamble, as if continuing a conversation she'd been having internally, "I had a student once, 40 years ago, the best I ever taught. She left, and I didn't hear from her again, and I spent so long grieving than not knowing whether the teaching had taken, whether she had used it, whether the years I had given her to her education had produced anything or been wasted. I spent so long grieving it that I almost missed the evidence that was right in front of me." She was quiet. "The village east of here, the one the young man came from, his village, the elder who told him the stories, that was her student. 3 removes. The teaching had gone 3 removes and was still going." The fox looked at her. "That's what I was thinking about this spring," she said slowly, "the distributed nature of the preservation." "Yes," the woman said, "you were right to think about it."
She left before the evening birds settled. She left cleanly, without looking back, without extended farewell, in the manner of someone who has accomplished what they came to accomplish, and trusts the accomplishment to continue without requiring their continued presence. The fox watched her go until she became a shape in the distance, and then a theory, and then nothing. 3 more visitors came over the following years, and the fox attended to each of them with the full quality of presence that the vigil had made possible in her. A middle-aged woman who had been a keeper in a distant tradition, not of fire, but of a language that was dying, who came to understand the mechanics of preservation, the specific interior practices of someone who had done this for a long time and survived it. They talked for a week. The fox gave her what she had, not techniques, not a methodology, but the honest account of what the years had asked of her, and what she had found in herself to give. And the woman wrote none of it down, but carried it in the way that certain things are carried, not as information, but as orientation, as a slight and permanent shift in the angle from which she looked at her own vigil. A young woman came who asked only to sit beside the ember for a day without speaking, and the fox gave her this, and she sat and she wept for most of the day, and at the end of the day she said thank you and left. And the fox did not know what she had needed or whether she had found it, but she had been present for the finding or not finding, and this seemed like the right thing to have been. An old man came who argued with her brilliantly and at length about whether the ember's preservation was ethical, whether it was right to maintain the possibility of the fire's return when the world had organized itself in the fire's absence into forms that the fire's return would necessarily disrupt. The argument was the best she had encountered in a long time, and she engaged with it fully and without defensiveness, and she did not conclude that he was wrong in everything he said, and she maintained the vigil anyway, because the ethics of presence are not always resolved by argument, and sometimes require a different kind of engagement, the engagement of someone who has looked at the full complexity of a situation and nonetheless said yes, still, this. The years accumulated, the seasons did their cycling, the ember breathed. She arrived at summer's end, in the week when everything is simultaneously ripe and elegiac, the week when the light falls horizontal and golden on everything, and makes even exhausted gray stone look briefly like something worth the entire journey to find. She was 12, perhaps 13, in that corridor between the selves. She came without ceremony and without self-consciousness. She simply walked up and sat down, cross-legged in the ash, as if this were the most obvious place to be. "Hello," said the fox. "Hello," said the girl. "Is that the last ember?" "Yes." "I've heard about it since I was small," said the girl.
My grandmother told me, and she told me her grandmother told her, and she said there was always someone who had heard from someone before them. She said this without drama, as a simple transmission of lineage. I wanted to see it. You're seeing it. The girl leaned forward until the amber light caught her face, the ember's light finding her features and making them specific, making her a particular person rather than a category of person, in the way that firelight has always done. She had dark, serious eyes, and a quality of attention in them that the fox recognized with an immediacy that was almost physical. The quality of a person who cannot help looking at important things carefully, who is constitutionally incapable of the casual glance. Can I get closer? Yes. Don't touch it. The girl moved until she was perhaps a foot from the ember and looked at it with total concentration for a very long time. The fox watched her look. The evening deepened around them. The summer birds called their end-of-day calls, unhurried as if the season were not almost over.
"What was it like?" the girl asked, still looking at the ember. "Do you want the honest answer or the beautiful answer?" the fox asked. The girl looked up. "Are they different?" "Sometimes. The beautiful answer is what people expect to hear. It's accurate, but it's the part of the accuracy that makes a good story. The honest answer is the full answer, which includes the parts that don't make good stories." The girl thought about this. "The honest one," she said. "The honest answer," the fox said, "is that I don't fully remember it, and the part of that I find most interesting is why I don't fully remember it. It's not that the memory has faded the way old memories fade. I have very old memories that are perfectly clear. It's that the great fire was so much larger than what I can hold in memory, that my memory of it is like a map of a mountain drawn by someone who stood at its base, accurate in the general outline, missing almost everything specific. What I remember is not the fire itself, but the quality of what was possible in its presence. The feeling that the important questions were not dangerous, that looking directly at the things that frighten you was survivable. That's what the fire gave, not answers, but the condition in which genuine questions were possible. It made the dark feel like a space for inquiry rather than a space for fear. She paused. That's the beautiful answer, more or less. The honest part is that I don't know for certain whether the fire's return would give that back. I believe it would, but I have been wrong about things before." The girl looked at the ember again for a while. Then, "I want to learn how to guard it." The fox was very still. "When you're gone," the girl said, "I want to be the one who knows how." "Why?" the fox asked, as before, not skeptically, not protectively, genuinely. "Because I've been thinking about it since I was 7 years old," the girl said. "That's when my grandmother first told me. And I think," she paused, "she was doing real thinking, not the performance of thinking.
The fox had learned to tell the difference, and this was the real thing. I think the things worth having in a life are the ones that ask more than you know you have, the ones that make you find out what you're made of, not by telling you, but by requiring you to find out. She looked at the fox directly. I'm not afraid of it being hard. I'm a little afraid of the loneliness, but I'm more afraid of living a life that never asked me anything real. There was a long silence. The ember breathed, in and out, with its patient, particular rhythm. The summer evening settled toward dark around them, the birds completing their accounting of the day. The horizontal light moved across the stones, slowly, the way all honest light moves, not rushing toward darkness, but arriving there with full acknowledgement of what is being left behind. You should be afraid of the loneliness, the fox said. Not cripplingly afraid, not so afraid that it prevents you from choosing this, if you choose it, but respectfully afraid, the way you are afraid of anything with genuine power over you. The loneliness here has power. I want you to know that going in, with accurate knowledge, rather than discovering it after you've committed without being told.
I hear that, the girl said. Go home first, the fox said. You're 12. You have a life to live before you come back to this one. Go back and live it completely. Let it teach you what it knows. Come back when you've learned what the ordinary world has to teach you, because you will need all of it here. The extraordinary life requires the ordinary one as its foundation. Don't come back before you're ready. How will I know when I'm ready? You'll know the same way I knew the morning I walked to the Ember and said, "All right then." Not by certainty, by the inability to not. The girl left the next morning. She walked without hesitation in the direction she had come from. She did not look back. The fox watched her go and felt, for the first time in a long time, for the first time since the old woman had arrived with her practical tea and her accurate diagnosis, the specific quality of not being alone that requires another person to provide, the quality that no amount of productive solitude and no degree of peace with your own company can substitute for. Someone was coming back. Someone would be here. Chapter 10. The Teaching Years. She came back in 3 years. She was almost 16, taller, with a quality of settled seriousness in her eyes that had not been there before. The seriousness of someone who has been paying honest attention to their life and found in the paying of it a self worth being serious about. She came with a pack and practical boots and the unsentimental directness of someone who has made a decision and arrived at its implementation. "I'm ready," she said. The fox looked at her. "Not quite," she said, "but you're close." The girl smiled, briefly, without rancor. "How close?" "Close enough to begin." The teaching was not what either of them had imagined, which is the nature of genuine teaching. The girl had imagined something more formal, a curriculum perhaps, a sequence of knowledge to be transmitted and assessed. The fox had imagined something more natural, a gradual, organic absorption. What actually happened was messier and more interesting than either expectation. It began with simply doing the work together, side by side, in the daily practice of the vigil, the morning assessment of the ember's state,
the midday maintenance, the specific attentiveness of the late-night hours. The girl was a quick learner in the technical sense. She absorbed the practical knowledge fast, with the focused hunger of someone who has been waiting for this specific knowledge for years and meets it with immediate recognition when it arrives. But the deeper learning, the interior learning, the learning about what the vigil asked from the inside, this came slowly, which was correct. There is no fast way to learn the things that can only be learned over time. The fox taught her patience by example, not by explaining patience or describing its virtues, but by being patient daily, visibly, in every way that the vigil required, so that the girl had a model that was not abstract but embodied, not instructional but actual. She taught her the difference between watching and attending by pointing it out in real time, saying one afternoon, "You are watching the Ember right now. Can you feel the difference between what you're doing and what I'm doing?" And waiting while the girl reached for the distinction and found it, in the particular interior way that one finds things that cannot be pointed to directly, but only approached from the inside. She taught her about the visitors, how to recognize the kind of need someone is carrying before they have described it, how to hold a space in which difficult things could be said without accidentally collapsing the space by reaching towards solutions before the full difficulty had been given room, how to say no with respect, how to say yes with appropriate care, how to recognize the difference between a person who needs to be heard and a person who needs to be answered, and how to provide the former without slipping into the latter through the desire to be helpful. She taught her about doubt, and this was perhaps the most important teaching, the one the girl came back to most often in the years that followed. The doubt is not your enemy, the fox said. The doubt is the evidence that your relationship to the vigil is honest. A person who does not doubt what they are doing has stopped looking at it. The doubt means you are still looking. The trick is not to eliminate the doubt, that would mean looking away, but to develop a relationship with it that is neither capitulation nor suppression. You acknowledge it, you examine it, you find what is true in it because there is always something true in it, and you update accordingly. And then you stay anyway, not in spite of the doubt, but informed by it. The staying is better for the doubt. It is staying with full knowledge of the difficulty, which is more honest than staying in naive certainty. And honesty is what this vigil was always about. The girl argued with her, which the fox appreciated. She was not a docile student. She had opinions about the teaching, and some of her opinions were wrong, and she revised them when shown why, and some of her opinions were right, and the fox revised her own understanding accordingly. This was the best kind of teaching, the kind that goes in both directions. The fox found herself, in the years of this teaching, understanding the vigil more clearly than she had in many decades, found that explaining it required her to examine it at levels of specificity she had not previously accessed, the way writing something down forces a precision that thinking alone does not require. She taught her about the distributed nature of the preservation, the conversation the old woman had opened with the story of the student and the student's student, which the fox had been developing into a full understanding for years. The vigil was not solitary, even when it felt solitary. The vigil was the visible center of a vast, invisible work, a work being done by every person who had walked away from this place carrying honest knowledge, who had given that knowledge to someone else, who had received it and passed it on in turn. The fox was the point of continuity, the physical, persistent presence that connected the fire's past to its possible future. But the work was distributed, and the woman and the girl beside the ember, and the student 3 removes away, and the young man in the eastern valley, and the old woman facing west for reasons she could not name, were all, each in their own way, keeping something alive. This was not a comfort that diminished the difficulty of the vigil, but it was a true understanding of what the vigil was part of, and the true understanding made the carrying of it different, not lighter exactly, but more accurately weighted. Years passed. The girl became a young woman, and the young woman's understanding of the vigil deepened into the understanding that comes only from having lived within it, from having experienced the loneliness in its full variety, from having been through the hard mornings and the doubt-filled nights, and the visitors who arrived in need, and the visitors who arrived with company, and the long seasons between visitors when the only thing happening was the daily, unremarkable, continuous practice of staying. She found what the fox had told her she would find, that the vigil was not what she had imagined, which was true, and was also exactly what she had chosen, which was also true. Both of these facts coexisted without contradiction in the way that the ember coexisted with its own dual nature, the last of what had been and the first of what could be, simultaneously without resolution.
It happened in the 7th year of the teaching, in the deepest part of a winter that was genuinely deep, not the ordinary aftermath winter of gray persistence, but a true, serious, consequential winter, the kind that has not visited this landscape in living memory. The storm arrived in the night, without the gradual gathering that storms usually announce themselves with. It arrived fully formed, already enormous, with a wind that was not the ordinary cold wind of winter, but something with an older quality to it, a wind that knew exactly what it was doing, and was doing it with complete commitment. The temperature dropped so fast that the fox woke from sleep to a cold she did not immediately recognize, so outside the range of her experience of cold that her first thought was that something had gone wrong with her own body. She looked at the ember. It was the smallest she had ever seen it, barely the size of a thumb. The orange at its center had retreated to a point, the smallest possible point, a concentration of warmth at the absolute edge of presence, so compressed that it was almost not visible. The gray ash had crept almost all the way across its surface. Its breathing was barely perceptible, not the shallow breathing of the hard nights that she had learned to understand and work with, but something genuinely closer to absence than she had ever witnessed, something that made the word last echo in her mind with a different weight than it had ever carried before. The girl was awake immediately. The girl had developed, by this point in the teaching, a sensitivity to the ember similar to the fox's, the way any long practitioner develops sensitivity to the thing they have been attending to for years. She was at the fox's side in seconds, crouching over the ember, her face in the near dark,
her expression controlled in a way that the fox recognized as the expression of someone whose internal response is considerably larger than what they are allowing their face to show. "What do we do?" she asked, quiet, direct. No panic in it, which the fox noted with something that was not quite pride, but was adjacent to it. "We stay with it," the fox said. "Everything we know, we use. Everything we have, we give." What followed was the longest night either of them had known. They took turns, one always attending, one resting for a short period and then returning, so that the Ember had constant presence, constant company, no moment in which it was alone with its own decision about whether to continue. They sheltered it from the wind with their bodies, physically. They worked to block the worst of the cold's access without creating conditions that would smother the tiny remaining spark. They held the available stillness posture at its most extreme concentration, not performing it, not applying a technique, but doing the thing itself, the real thing, the being present with complete attention that the technique was always an approximation of.
And they talked to it. The fox had never done this before, had always felt, vaguely, that talking to the Ember was a kind of sentimentality that the vigil's honesty did not permit. But in this night, with the Ember this close, and this close to the decision point, the talking felt not like sentimentality, but like the most natural thing available, the transmission of presence through the medium of voice, the oldest communication, the thing the first people had done when they sat at the fire's edge and built their first words. She talked to it in the old language, what she still remembered of it, not the names, those were not forgiving, but the words that had been built at its edge. Warm, light, here, together. The girl talked to it in her own language, in her own voice, telling it things she had not yet said out loud, why she had come here, what she had given to be here, what she hoped for it, what she intended it. It was the most honest speaking the fox had ever heard from a young person, and it was honest precisely because it was spoken without an audience, spoken to something that could not judge it, could not respond to it, could only receive it or not receive it. The storm lasted 2 days. In the second day, the wind eased slightly, not gone, not safe, but diminished enough that the worst of its pressure was removed, and in the easing, the Ember breathed. Not differently than before, no dramatic expansion, no visible increase in the point of orange at its center, simply continued. The same barely perceptible breath, the same compressed point of warmth, but continued, which was the thing. Still there, still the last of what was, and the first of what could be, still holding both without resolving either, still grieving in the dark of a winter that had tried and not succeeded. The girl sat back on her heels and pressed her hands against her face for a moment, a gesture the fox recognized as the physical expression of the release of sustained tension, the body's method of marking the transition from crisis to aftermath. Then she lowered her hands and looked at the Ember and looked at the fox. She said, "That was the closest." "Yes," the fox said, "that was the closest." They looked at each other. The winter continued around them, diminished but not finished, the stones cold, and the sky the deep gray of a storm still in residence even as it eased. "If it had gone out," the girl said, "what would we have done?" The fox looked at her steadily. "I don't know," she said. "I have never let myself think about it fully,
because I believed that thinking about it fully would be a kind of preparation for it, and I refused to prepare for it. I only prepared for its continuation." She paused. "I still don't know what I would have done, but I know what you would have done." The girl waited. "You would have stayed," the fox said, "and you would have tended the nothing, and you would have kept the place warm with your own presence, and you would have believed, not with certainty, but with the maybe that is more honest than certainty, that a fire that had burned for this long had not finished. And you would have been right to believe that, because this is also true of fires. They can appear to go out, and then they are found in the ash, still breathing. It came in the spring, as the things that have been building for a long time often arrive in spring, not with drama, but with the unremarkable clarity of something whose moment has simply come. The fox woke one morning with the knowledge of it already present, not as a thought, not as a decision she was making, but as a fact she was discovering, that she had done what she had come to do, that the vigil had been kept and is still being kept, and would continue to be kept, that the continuation was assured, not by certainty, which was never the guarantee on offer, but by the quality of the person sitting on the warm rock, who had become the kind of thing that does this, who had become the vigil's continuity as she herself had become it. The passing was not a diminishment, and it was not a failure, and it was not a defeat. It was the oldest and most necessary act of the keepership, the giving forward. She told the woman, the girl had been the girl no longer for several years now, she told her on a morning when the light was good, when the quality of the air carried the particular freshness of a spring that was genuinely trying, when the birds were back and earnest in their calling. She told her simply, "It's yours now, not because I am giving it. I cannot give it. It cannot be given, because you are already it, because you have been it in practice for longer than either of us has acknowledged." The woman looked at her, then at the ember, then back at her. "You're leaving," she said. "I am finished," the fox said. "These are not the same thing." The woman was quiet for a long time. The fox recognized the quality of her quiet. It was not grief, or not only grief. It was the quiet of someone holding several large things at once, the ending and the continuing, the loss and the legacy, the fact that both of these things were happening simultaneously in the same moment, in the same small piece of the world. "Will you come back?" the woman asked. "I don't know," the fox said honestly. "I don't know what comes next for me, or whether it contains the possibility of return. What I know is that whatever comes next, I will have done this. The ember is breathing, the vigil continues, the maybe is still alive." She looked at the ember one last time, looked at it with the full quality of attention that years of tending had made available to her, with the knowing that was not watching, but something more intimate and more durable. She said, "That is enough. That is exactly enough." She left in the early afternoon. She walked in a direction the woman did not recognize, which meant she was going somewhere entirely new, somewhere outside the map of what either of them had known. She did not look back. The woman sat on the warm rock and watched her go until she was nothing. Then she turned to the ember. It was breathing. Here is the thing about embers that people misunderstand. An ember is not a fire in decline. This is the most common misunderstanding, and it is comprehensive, and it is wrong in precisely the way that matters most. An ember is not a failing fire, not a dying fire, not the last exhausted remnant of something that peaked and is now on its way to nothing. That understanding is available to the surface of the observation. It is what an ember looks like if you approach it without history, without the knowledge of what it contains, without the context of what it has survived, and what it is still, despite everything, doing. An ember is also a beginning. The same object, that ash-gray, thumb-sized, shallow-breathing coal, contains within itself two complete and simultaneous truths. It is the last of what was, the final concentrated remainder of a fire that once filled the world with light and warmth, and the specific permission to look honestly at important things. And it is the first of what could be, the seed, the source, the irreducible point from which restoration becomes, if the conditions arrive, possible. It holds both of these truths completely, without resolving the tension between them, without choosing one over the other, simply holding, in the most literal sense, the contradiction that most things cannot sustain.
This is what makes it, in a very precise sense, the most complete thing in the world, the most honest thing. Because the most honest description of most living things, most people, most relationships, most projects and commitments and loves, is exactly this. They are simultaneously the last of what was and the first of what could be. They are in the middle of something that has a past and might have a future, and the middle is where we live, without the certainty of either direction, holding both. The ember does not pretend that this is comfortable. The ember does not perform optimism or resignation. The ember simply continues, doing the only thing available to it, which is to keep breathing, to maintain the point of orange at its center, to be present in the dark in whatever way is still possible. The woman sat on the warm rock. The winter would come again. It always came again. The ordinary ones and the terrible ones, the aftermath winters and the genuine ones, the ones you survive easily and the ones that require everything you have and the presence of another person to get through. It would come again, and she would sit with the ember through it, as the fox had sat with it, as the keepers before them had sat in the centuries when the sitting was a different kind of sitting, when the fire was enormous and the sitting was not about preservation, but about belonging, about being one of the creatures gathered at the edge of the warmth, simply present in the simple presence of something true. She had been asked by a visitor the previous autumn, a young man, earnest, with careful eyes, not like the one who had come before him, whether she ever doubted that the fire would return. She had given him the honest answer, which was yes, sometimes, in the deep of the night, in the accumulated weight of the hard seasons, the doubt arrived with its full gravity and made its full case. And then she had given him the answer underneath that answer, which was the doubt did not change what she did, because what she did was not contingent on certainty. It was contingent on the ember, on the fact of the ember's breathing, which was a fact regardless of what she believed about its ultimate trajectory.
on the recognition that presence was owed to things that were still alive, regardless of whether you could guarantee what they would become. You owed the presence. You owed the tending. What the tending produced was beyond your authority, and releasing it, releasing the claim on the outcome while retaining the commitment to the practice, was the most clarifying thing she had done in her life. She did not know when the fire would return. She did not know if it would return in her lifetime, or the student's lifetime, or the lifetime of whoever came after. She knew that the conditions were improving, slowly, the way all real improvements improve, without announcement, without drama, by the accumulation of many ordinary acts of remembering done in ordinary lives by people who were not always sure what they were doing, but could not stop themselves from doing it. The young men with careful boots, walking 3 weeks on failing boots. The teachers whose students carry the teaching 3 removes and further. The old women who bring tea to people sitting alone in gray landscapes and ask the accurate questions. All of it accumulating in the patient arithmetic of a restoration that has no schedule and no guarantee and no one in charge of it, but the whole distributed, improbable, stubbornly ongoing human work of not forgetting.
This is what makes it, in a very precise sense, the most complete thing in the world, the most honest thing, because the most honest description of most living things, most people, most relationships, most projects and commitments and loves, is exactly this. They are simultaneously the last of what was and the first of what could be. They are in the middle of something that has a past and might have a future, and the middle is where we live, without the certainty of either direction, holding both. The ember does not pretend that this is comfortable. The ember does not perform optimism or resignation. The ember simply continues, doing the only thing available to it, which is to keep breathing, to maintain the point of orange at its center, to be present in the dark in whatever way is still possible. The woman sat on the warm rock. The winter would come again, as it always came, the ordinary ones and the terrible ones, the aftermath winters and the genuine ones, the ones you survive easily, and the ones that require everything you have and the presence of another person to get through. She would sit with the ember through it again, as the fox had sat with it, as the keepers before them had sat in the centuries when the sitting was a different kind of sitting, when the fire was enormous, and the sitting was not about preservation, but about belonging, about being one of the creatures gathered at the edge of the warmth, simply present in the simple presence of something true. She had been asked by a visitor the previous autumn, a young man, earnest, with careful eyes, not at all unlike the one who had come before him, whether she ever doubted that the fire would return. She gave him the honest answer, which was, yes, sometimes, in the deep of the night, in the accumulated weight of the hard seasons, the doubt arrived with its full gravity and made its full case. And then she had given him the answer underneath that answer, which was that the doubt did not change what she did, because what she did was not contingent on certainty. It was contingent on the ember, on the fact of the ember's breathing, which was a fact regardless of what she believed about its ultimate trajectory, on the recognition that presence was owed to things that were still alive, regardless of whether you could guarantee what they would become.
You owed the presence. You owed the tending. What the tending produced was beyond your authority, and releasing it, releasing the claim on the outcome while retaining the commitment to the practice, was the most clarifying thing she had done in her life. She did not know when the fire would return. She did not know if it would return in her lifetime or her student's lifetime or the lifetime of whoever came after. She knew that the conditions were improving, slowly, the way all real improvements improve, without announcement, without drama, by the accumulation of many ordinary acts of remembering done in ordinary lives by people who were not always sure what they were doing, but could not stop themselves from doing it. The young men with careful eyes, walking 3 weeks on failing boots. The teachers whose students carry the teaching 3 removes and further. The old women who bring tea to people sitting alone in gray landscapes and ask the accurate questions, all of it accumulating in the patient arithmetic of a restoration that has no schedule and no guarantee, and no one in charge of it, but the whole, distributed, improbable, stubbornly ongoing human work of not forgetting. The ember breathed. In. Out. The light was small. The light was small, and it was steady, and it was there. And the world arranged itself in the dark around it, the way the dark has always arranged itself around the things that have not yet finished, not as a threat, not as a weight, but as a space, as the space in which discovery is still possible, as the permission. The fox who guarded the last ember. I find myself at the end of this story not wanting to speak immediately, which I think is the sign of a story that has done its work. The sign that the words have landed somewhere interior and are still settling, and that speaking too quickly would interrupt something that needs the quiet to finish. I'll say only this. Whatever your ember is, whatever small, barely breathing thing you are sitting beside in your own life, choosing daily, choosing again on the hard mornings when the doubt arrives with its full gravity, and the outcome feels uncertain, and the cold is genuinely serious, that thing is both what the fox said it was, it is the last of what was, and it is the first of what could be. It deserves your presence. It deserves the quality of attention that the fox called knowing, not watching, not guarding with anxiety, not managing with the urgency of someone who believes that their vigilance alone is all that stands between the light and the dark. Just knowing, just being there, just staying again for the oldest and most unglamorous and most necessary of reasons, because you cannot bear not to. The fire does not ask you to believe in it. It only asks you to tend it. Thank you for your time, for your listening, for the particular quality of attention that you bring to these evenings. It matters more than I can tell you. If you'd like to find us and continue the conversation, we're on Patreon. Link in the description. Until next time, my dear night dwellers, this has been Fox. Keep the ember.